That voice, it can't still exist. Richard Caldwell whispered the words to himself before he even realized he'd spoken them. The rain had been falling over downtown Chicago for nearly an hour, turning the sidewalks into shimmering ribbons of reflected headlights and broken neon. Business executives hurried beneath black umbrellas, rideshare drivers leaned on their horns, and steam drifted lazily from subway grates into the cold October air. Richard barely noticed any of it. At 61 years old, the billionaire founder of Caldwell Capital had long trained himself to ignore the sounds of the city. Noise belonged to everyone else. Silence belonged to him. His chauffeur held open the rear door of a black SUV parked outside the Grand Lakes Hotel after another charity gala Richard had attended more out of obligation than desire. His tailored overcoat fit perfectly. His polished shoes reflected the wet pavement. A photographer called his name from across the street, but Richard simply nodded without looking. Then it happened. A voice floated through the rain, soft at first, fragile, almost swallowed by traffic. Yet somehow every note traveled straight through the cold air, as though the city itself had stopped breathing just long enough to let the melody pass. Richard's hand froze halfway toward the door handle. The keys slipped from his fingers, striking the sidewalk with a metallic click that sounded impossibly loud. His chauffeur bent down immediately. "Sir?" Richard didn't answer. His eyes searched across the crowded plaza until they found the source. Beneath the rusted awning of an abandoned train entrance stood a boy no older than 12. His oversized gray hoodie hung loosely over narrow shoulders. His sneakers were worn thin enough that rainwater darkened the fabric around his toes. A faded backpack rested against an old brick wall beside a dented guitar case, with only a handful of crumpled dollar bills inside. The boy wasn't asking anyone for money. He wasn't calling after strangers or holding up a cardboard sign. He simply stood with his eyes closed, singing as if the entire city had disappeared. People rushed past, without slowing down. Some glanced for barely a second before returning to glowing phone screens. Others stepped around the open guitar case without making eye contact. A little girl tugged her father's sleeve, wanting to stop, but he gently pulled her along before the traffic light changed. The boy never reacted. His voice carried warmth that didn't belong to the cold evening. It sounded lived in, honest, like someone singing not because the world was listening, but because singing was the only place where loneliness couldn't reach him. Richard felt something tighten, deep inside his chest. It wasn't simply the melody. Thousands of people knew that old hymn. But the phrasing, the pauses, the tiny rise at the end of each chorus. No recording had ever sounded like that. Only one person had sung it exactly that way. Emily, his late wife, had sung those same notes every Sunday morning while making pancakes in their first apartment more than 30 years earlier. She laughed whenever she forgot a lyric and always tapped the kitchen counter twice before beginning the final verse. Richard hadn't heard that version since the day cancer had stolen her voice forever. Yet somehow, standing beneath a leaking awning on a rainy Chicago sidewalk, a homeless black boy was singing it exactly the same way. Richard took one slow step away from the waiting SUV, then another. The rain soaked the shoulders of his expensive coat, but he didn't seem to notice. Across the street, the boy opened his eyes for the first time. They met Richard's gaze only for a heartbeat before returning to the song, calm, steady, completely unaware that somewhere inside the silent billionaire standing in the rain, a door sealed shut for nearly 20 years had begun to open. Richard did not remember telling his chauffeur to leave. At some point, the black SUV quietly pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the stream of evening traffic while he remained standing beneath the rain with his hands buried inside his coat pockets. The song ended not with dramatic applause but with silence. A few people tossed folded bills into the old guitar case before continuing home. One woman smiled politely. A delivery driver nodded in appreciation. Within seconds, the sidewalk returned to its endless rhythm, as though nothing remarkable had happened. The boy knelt carefully beside the guitar case and counted the damp bills one by one, $11, 38 cents in coins. He slipped every dollar into a weathered envelope tucked safely inside his backpack before placing the loose change into a separate zipper pocket. There was no excitement on his face, only quiet calculation. He looked like someone making certain tomorrow could exist. Richard stayed where he was, watching from across the street without saying a word. He expected the boy to buy dinner first. Instead, the child zipped the guitar case closed, slung the faded backpack over one shoulder, and began walking several blocks north. Curiosity pulled Richard forward before reason could stop him. He followed from a distance, careful not to be noticed. They passed expensive restaurants where warm light spilled through tall windows onto the sidewalk. Couples laughed over steak dinners. Families gathered around birthday cakes. The smell of fresh bread drifted into the cool air, but the boy never slowed his pace. At the corner of Madison and Wells, he entered a neighborhood pharmacy. Richard waited outside beneath the awning, watching through the glass. The boy stood patiently in line behind office workers and parents carrying shopping baskets. When his turn finally came, he handed the cashier several folded bills and a handful of quarters. The cashier recognized him immediately and reached beneath the counter for a small paper bag without asking questions. The exchange lasted less than a minute. When the boy stepped back onto the sidewalk, Richard caught a glimpse of the label inside the bag. It was cough medicine, a box of fever reducers, and a package of instant soup. The child hugged the paper bag close to his chest before hurrying toward an old brick church 2 blocks away. Behind the building, sheltered beneath a narrow overhang from the rain, sat an elderly man wrapped in 2 faded blankets. His silver beard was neatly trimmed, despite the hardship written across his tired face. The boy smiled the moment he saw him. "Good news, Mr. Henry," he said with quiet excitement. "Your cough medicine finally came in." The old man looked surprised. "Elijah, you should have bought yourself dinner first." Elijah shook his head gently while opening the paper bag. "Miss Angela at the clinic said your fever has to come down. We can eat after you take this." Richard felt his breathing slow. The boy carefully unscrewed the medicine bottle, poured the correct amount into the measuring cup, and waited until the older man swallowed every drop. Only then did Elijah remove one small sandwich from his backpack. He broke it neatly into 2 equal halves and handed the larger piece to Mr. Henry without hesitation. "You always give me the bigger half," the old man said with a tired smile. Elijah shrugged. "You always pretend not to notice." They both laughed softly, their voices almost disappearing beneath the steady rain. Standing across the narrow alley, Richard realized something that unsettled him, far more than the song ever could. This child possessed almost nothing the world considered valuable. Yet every choice he made was guided by someone else's needs before his own. Richard had spent decades building companies worth billions of dollars. Watching Elijah share half of a simple sandwich beneath a leaking church roof, he could not remember the last time wealth had looked so small. Richard remained where he was long after Elijah and Mr. Henry finished their modest meal. The rain had softened into a light mist that clung to the church bricks and left tiny beads of water glimmering beneath the streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across the city, followed by the steady rumble of steel wheels disappearing into the night. Elijah carefully folded the empty soup box and slipped it into a nearby recycling bin instead of leaving it behind. Even in hardship, he treated the small corner of the city with quiet respect. Mr. Henry wrapped the second blanket tighter around his shoulders and looked up at the boy with gentle eyes. "You still planning to sing tomorrow?" he asked. Elijah nodded. "People smile more on Fridays. They stay longer after work." The old man chuckled softly. "Your mother always said music finds people before people find music." Elijah's smile faded into something quieter. "I still hear her saying that sometimes." Richard felt his heartbeat slow. He had heard almost those exact words decades earlier. Emily used to say them every time a young student became nervous before a recital. She believed songs had a way of reaching hearts that conversations never could. Richard had not thought about that sentence in years. Not once. Yet here it was again, spoken by a boy who had no reason to know it. Elijah reached into his backpack and carefully removed a small notebook wrapped inside a clear plastic freezer bag to protect it from the rain. The cover had once been blue but had faded to gray with age. He opened it with extraordinary care, turning each page as though touching something precious. Lines of handwritten lyrics filled the worn paper. Some pages carried small musical notes drawn in pencil. Others held encouraging messages written in elegant cursive. "Mr." Henry smiled the moment he saw it. "Still carrying her notebook everywhere?" Elijah nodded without looking up. "It feels like she is still teaching me." He traced one handwritten sentence gently with his finger before closing the notebook again. Richard could not read the words from across the alley, but something about the handwriting stirred an ache buried deep inside him. Emily had written with the same graceful curves, the same patient loops in every letter. He suddenly realized he was holding his breath. A cold breeze swept through the narrow street, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves and fresh coffee from a nearby diner. Elijah zipped the notebook safely back into the backpack before standing. "I should go before the shelter fills up," he said quietly. Mr. Henry gave him an understanding nod. "If they are full again?" Elijah shrugged with a small smile that seemed much older than 12. "Then I will find another safe place. I always do." Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment. Those simple words landed heavier than any business negotiation he had ever faced. This child spoke about uncertainty with the calm acceptance of someone who had repeated the same conversation too many times. Elijah adjusted the straps of his backpack and started walking toward the bus station several blocks away. Richard watched until the boy disappeared behind a row of glowing storefront windows. Only then did he finally pull his phone from his coat pocket. His thumb hovered over one contact before pressing the screen. The call connected almost immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell," his executive assistant answered. "I need a favor," Richard said quietly, his voice unusually restrained. "First thing, tomorrow morning, I want you to find every public record you can on a 12-year-old boy named Elijah Brooks. School records, shelter registrations, social services, anything that exists. Discreetly." There was a brief silence on the other end. "May I ask why?" Richard looked toward the empty sidewalk, where the last notes of Elijah's song still seemed to linger in the damp night air. "Because," he answered slowly, "something about his story has already found me, and I have the feeling it has only just begun." The following morning arrived, wrapped in pale gray clouds that muted the Chicago skyline beneath a blanket of cool autumn light. Richard Caldwell sat alone in the corner office on the 52nd floor of Caldwell Capital, staring through floor-to-ceiling windows without seeing the city beyond them. His untouched coffee had already gone cold. Normally, his mornings began with market reports, acquisition briefings, and conference calls scheduled down to the minute. Today, every document lying across his polished walnut desk remained unopened. Instead, his thoughts kept returning to a quiet sidewalk, an old hymn, and a boy who had somehow carried hope inside a worn backpack. A soft knock interrupted the silence. His executive assistant, Melissa Grant, stepped inside carrying a slim manila folder. She hesitated before placing it carefully on the desk. "This is everything we could legally locate overnight," she said. "There is not much." Richard looked at the thin folder. "That is all?" Melissa nodded. "No active school enrollment, no permanent address, temporary shelter records that stopped nearly 8 months ago. His mother, Angela Brooks, passed away a little over a year ago after a long illness. There are no records identifying his father." Richard slowly opened the folder. A single intake photograph showed Elijah wearing the same calm expression he had seen beneath the train station awning. Even in the poorly lit picture, the boy's eyes carried an unusual steadiness. There was no resentment, no fear, only quiet endurance. Richard continued reading. Angela Brooks had worked part-time cleaning offices while singing at community events whenever she could find the opportunity. Several neighbors described her as generous despite having very little. One handwritten note from a volunteer caught Richard's attention. She believed music gave children dignity before the world gave them opportunity. His fingers stopped moving across the page. Emily had once written nearly the same sentence inside the front cover of a music curriculum she created for underprivileged students decades earlier. Richard leaned back slowly. Coincidences were beginning to pile upon one another in ways logic could no longer comfortably explain. Melissa watched him carefully. "There is something else," she said. "Every shelter employee we contacted described Elijah the same way." Richard looked up. "How?" "They all said he spends more time helping other people than asking for help himself." One manager even remembered that he organized children into singing circles during the holidays because he thought lonely people smiled longer when they heard music. Richard lowered his eyes again. Somewhere inside him, a memory stirred with startling clarity. Emily standing before a group of nervous children in an old church basement, encouraging them to sing louder. Because kindness could travel farther than fear. He could almost hear her laugh echoing through the years. Before he realized it, he was smiling for the first time in months. Melissa noticed immediately. "Sir?" Richard closed the folder gently. "Clear my afternoon." She blinked in surprise. "You have 3 board meetings and an investor luncheon. Reschedule all of them." Everyone. Melissa had worked beside Richard for nearly 15 years. She had never once heard him postpone an entire afternoon without a financial emergency. Yet something in his voice discouraged further questions. "Very well," she replied softly before leaving the office. The room fell silent again, except for the quiet hum of the heating vents. Richard reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a small wooden box that had remained unopened for years. Dust clung lightly to its corners. He lifted the lid with slow, careful hands. Inside rested a faded photograph of Emily seated beside an upright piano, surrounded by smiling children from one of her free music workshops. Tucked beneath the photograph lay a folded concert program in her unmistakable handwriting. Richard traced the familiar letters with the tip of one finger before closing his eyes. For years he had convinced himself that looking backward only made grief heavier. Yet somehow a boy who owned almost nothing had made forgotten memories feel alive again. Richard slipped the photograph into the inside pocket of his coat, stood from his chair, and quietly whispered words he had not spoken in a very long time. "Emily, I think I need to hear that song again." By late afternoon, the rain had disappeared, leaving behind a crisp blue sky that reflected against the glass towers downtown. The air smelled cleaner, carrying the faint scent of damp pavement mixed with roasted coffee drifting from sidewalk cafes. Richard arrived nearly an hour before sunset, this time without a limousine waiting beside him. He had asked his security detail to remain several blocks away and chose to walk the final stretch alone. It had been years since he had crossed the city without an assistant setting the pace or a schedule pulling him forward. The familiar train entrance appeared at the end of the block exactly as he remembered. The rusted awning still dripped from yesterday's storm. Commuters flowed around it in steady waves. And there, standing beneath the fading afternoon light with his weathered guitar resting against one knee, was Elijah. The first gentle notes drifted across the sidewalk before Richard even reached the corner. Once again, the boy sang with his eyes half closed, completely absorbed in the music rather than the people passing by. Richard stopped several yards away, listening from the edge of the crowd. This time he noticed details he had missed before. Elijah smiled quietly whenever a child slowed down to listen. He nodded gratefully whenever someone dropped $1 into the guitar case. But when a businessman tossed a folded $20 bill from several feet away without breaking stride or making eye contact, Elijah picked up the bill, caught up with the man, and politely handed it back. "Sir," he said with a warm smile, "I think you dropped this by accident." The man looked confused. "No, that was for you." Elijah gently shook his head. "If you want to help, you can place it in the case while I am singing. My mom always said people should never feel invisible when they are giving kindness." The businessman hesitated, then slowly walked back, bent down, and carefully placed the bill inside the guitar case. "Thank you," Elijah said, looking directly into his eyes. "I appreciate you stopping." The man's expression softened as he nodded before continuing toward the train station. Richard felt an unexpected warmth settle over him. The lesson had taken less than 30 seconds, yet somehow the child had reminded a busy executive that generosity was not only about money, it was about presence. As twilight settled over the city, Elijah finished his final song and carefully packed away his guitar. Richard finally stepped forward. The boy looked up, recognizing the distinguished man who had quietly listened the previous evening. "Good evening, sir," Elijah said politely. "You came back." Richard smiled faintly. "I did." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of traffic filled the silence while the last rays of sunlight reflected across the wet sidewalk. Richard reached into his coat pocket, not for money, but for the small photograph of Emily. He looked at it for only a second before returning it to his pocket. Then he met Elijah's eyes. "You sing that hymn beautifully," he said softly. "Who taught it to you?" Elijah's face brightened immediately. "My mother." Richard felt his pulse quicken. "Did she teach music?" Elijah nodded. "Every chance she got. She said songs belong to everyone, even people who thought they had nothing." Richard swallowed carefully. The words landed with unsettling familiarity. He hesitated before asking the question that had quietly followed him since the night before. "Did your mother ever tell you where she learned that song?" Elijah looked down for a moment as if searching through old memories. Then he unzipped his backpack, reached inside with great care, and pulled out the same faded notebook, wrapped inside its clear plastic bag. Holding it gently against his chest, he looked back at Richard and answered with complete certainty. "She said a woman named Emily gave it to her many years ago. She always told me that if I ever met someone who remembered the song exactly the way she did, I should never let them walk away." Richard forgot about the evening traffic, the meetings he had postponed, and the phone vibrating silently inside his coat pocket. The noise of downtown Chicago faded until all that remained was the quiet certainty in Elijah's voice. A woman named Emily. The words lingered between them like the final note of a hymn that refused to disappear. Richard looked at the weathered notebook wrapped carefully inside the clear plastic bag. Even from a few feet away, he could see softened corners, faded paper, and a cover that had been opened thousands of times. It was not simply a notebook. It had become something sacred. Elijah noticed Richard's eyes resting on it and smiled gently. "Would you like to see it?" he asked. Richard hesitated. "Only if you are comfortable sharing it." The boy nodded without the slightest hesitation. Mom always believed songs become stronger when they are shared. He carefully unsealed the plastic bag before placing the notebook into Richard's hands. It weighed almost nothing. Yet Richard held it as though it were carved from glass. The pages released the faint scent of old paper mixed with lavender, a fragrance so familiar that his chest tightened unexpectedly. Emily had always tucked dried lavender inside her music books because she believed every memory deserved a gentle scent. Richard slowly opened the first page. Across the inside cover, written in graceful blue ink, were the words, "Music does not ask who you are before it comforts you." He closed his eyes. That sentence belonged to Emily. He had watched her write it dozens of times for children leaving her weekend music workshops. She believed every student deserved encouragement written by hand, because printed words never carried the same warmth. His thumb brushed lightly across the faded ink as though touching the past itself. Elijah watched quietly without interrupting. Around them, the city continued moving. Commuters hurried toward the train platforms. Streetlights flickered on one by one as daylight surrendered to evening. A bus sighed to a stop nearby before pulling away again. Yet inside the small circle created by one old notebook and two strangers, time seemed unwilling to move. Richard turned another page. Handwritten lyrics filled the paper, followed by small notes in the margin. "Breathe here, smile before the second verse. Let the silence sing too." Emily had written exactly the same reminders for nervous children preparing for performances. Then something else caught his attention. Tucked carefully between two pages rested an old photograph no larger than a postcard. The colors had faded with age, but the faces remained clear. Richard stared without blinking. There stood Emily, smiling beneath the wooden sign of a neighborhood community center, surrounded by children holding handmade songbooks. Beside her stood a young black woman with bright, hopeful eyes and shoulder-length curls. She looked no older than 20. Richard had never met her before, but he knew immediately who she was. Angela Brooks. Elijah leaned forward and smiled at the picture. "That was the first day they met," he said softly. "Mom used to tell me Miss Emily made everyone feel like they belonged before they even sang the first note." Richard swallowed carefully. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Did your mother ever tell you what happened after this picture was taken?" Elijah nodded. "She said Miss Emily told her something she never forgot." He paused for a moment, almost hearing the memory in his own mind. Then he repeated the words exactly as his mother had taught him. "If life ever becomes too heavy, do not stop singing. Someone you have never met may be depending on the hope inside your voice." Richard felt his vision blur. He had heard Emily speak those exact words once before, nearly 25 years earlier, but he had believed no one else remembered them. As he looked back down at the photograph resting in his trembling hands, One quiet realization settled into his heart. Emily had not disappeared from the world when she died. She had simply continued living inside people she had chosen to love. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Richard carefully slid the photograph back between the notebook pages, exactly where he had found it, before closing the cover with both hands. The city lights reflected across the clear plastic sleeve, as Elijah gently accepted the notebook back, holding it with the same care someone might give a treasured family heirloom. Around them, the evening crowd continued to flow through the station entrance, coats brushing together, footsteps echoing against damp concrete, conversations disappearing into the growing darkness. Yet inside Richard's heart, something had become unexpectedly quiet. It was a silence he had not felt since Emily was alive. Elijah slipped the notebook safely into his backpack before fastening the zipper. "Thank you for being careful with it," he said. Richard smiled softly. "Thank you for trusting me." The boy shrugged with a small grin. "Mom said you can usually tell who respects music by the way they touch old paper." Richard almost laughed. "Your mother was a wise woman." Elijah looked toward the sky where the last traces of sunlight had faded behind the buildings. "She learned from good people." A cold breeze drifted through the street, carrying dry autumn leaves across the sidewalk. Richard noticed Elijah pull the sleeves of his oversized hoodie over his hands to keep them warm. The gesture was small, almost automatic, but it unsettled him. He realized he had spent years approving multi-million-dollar budgets without hesitation, yet watching a child quietly hide cold hands inside worn fabric somehow felt heavier than signing any contract. "Have you had dinner yet?" Richard asked gently. Elijah smiled politely. "Not yet. Would you allow me to buy you a meal?" The boy paused for a moment before answering. "Can Mr. Henry come too?" Richard blinked. "Of course." Elijah nodded. "Then yes. He has been coughing less today, but warm soup would probably help." Richard felt another quiet lesson settle inside him. The boy had not asked what restaurant they would visit. He had not asked whether dessert was included or whether he could order anything expensive. His first thought had been someone else. They walked together through several blocks of evening traffic until they reached the church where Mr. Henry sat beneath the familiar overhang, reading a weathered paperback beneath the glow of a small battery lantern. He looked up with surprise as Elijah approached beside a sharply dressed older man. "Mr. Henry," Elijah called with an easy smile. "This is Mr. Richard. He invited us to dinner." The old man stood slowly, offering a respectful handshake. "Pleasure to meet you, sir." Richard returned the handshake warmly. "The pleasure is mine." A small family diner remained open across the street, its front windows glowing with warm yellow light and handwritten pie specials displayed beside the entrance. The smell of chicken noodle soup, fresh bread, and cinnamon drifted onto the sidewalk the moment they stepped inside. A waitress greeted Elijah by name. "You are back, sweetheart." Elijah smiled. "Only because somebody else is paying tonight." The waitress laughed softly before leading them to a booth near the window. Richard watched quietly as Elijah thanked her before sitting down. He noticed the boy fold his napkin neatly into his lap exactly the way Emily had always done. Even the simple words, "Yes, ma'am," and "Thank you very much," sounded familiar. During dinner, Elijah listened far more than he spoke. He asked Mr. Henry whether the medicine was helping. He thanked the waitress every time she refilled a glass. When the food arrived, he bowed his head for a brief silent prayer before taking the first bite. Richard found himself doing the same without thinking. It had been years since he had paused before a meal. As the conversation drifted from music to favorite books and old Chicago neighborhoods, Richard caught himself smiling more than once. Then, almost casually, "Mr. Henry looked across the table and said, "Angela always believed one day somebody from Miss Emily's family would hear Elijah sing. She said when that day finally came, a promise she made long ago could finally be kept." Richard slowly lowered his spoon into the bowl. The warmth of the soup suddenly seemed far away. He looked first at Mr. Henry, then at Elijah, whose quiet expression suggested he had heard those words many times before. Somewhere beyond the diner window, a train rolled through the station with a long, gentle whistle, and Richard realized that whatever promise Angela had protected all these years, he was only beginning to uncover it. The words lingered over the table long after Mr. Henry finished speaking. The gentle clatter of silverware, the quiet hum of conversations from nearby booths, and the soft melody of an old jazz record playing through the diner's ceiling speakers suddenly felt distant. Richard looked across the table at Elijah, but the boy simply stirred his soup with slow, thoughtful circles, as though the promise being mentioned had always been part of his life. Richard finally broke the silence. "What promise?" Mr. Henry smiled faintly before taking a careful sip of tea. "That is not my story to tell." He turned kindly toward Elijah. "Your mother wanted him to hear it from you, if this day ever came." Elijah lowered his eyes for a moment. His fingers rested lightly on the zipper of his backpack where the notebook remained tucked safely inside. "Mom talked about Miss Emily almost every week," he said quietly. "She said she met her when everything felt impossible." Richard leaned forward without realizing it. Elijah continued in the same calm voice. "My mother had just lost her apartment. She was working 2 cleaning jobs and sleeping on a friend's couch. She almost stopped singing because she thought dreams were for people with easier lives. Then she met Miss Emily at a free music class." Richard listened without interrupting. He could picture Emily perfectly. She had never cared whether someone arrived wearing a business suit or worn-out sneakers. Every Saturday morning she unlocked the doors of an old community center before sunrise, brewed coffee for parents, arranged folding chairs herself. Elijah smiled gently at the memory he had inherited. "Mom said Miss Emily never asked about money. She never asked where anyone lived. She only asked one question." Richard whispered before he could stop himself. "What song is already inside your heart?" Elijah looked up, surprised. "Yes." His eyes widened. That was exactly what she asked. Richard let out a slow breath. He had heard Emily ask that question hundreds of times. She believed every person carried a song long before they learned the notes. The waitress returned with a fresh basket of warm cornbread and quietly refilled their drinks before leaving them to their conversation. Outside the diner windows, the sidewalks glistened beneath rows of golden streetlights, while people hurried through the cool evening, carrying scarves and shopping bags. Inside, time continued to slow. Elijah carefully removed the notebook once again and opened it near the middle. Folded between 2 pages rested a cream-colored envelope, its edges softened with age. The front bore only 2 handwritten words. "For Richard." Richard stared at the envelope without moving. His own name, written in Emily's unmistakable handwriting, seemed almost impossible to comprehend. His heartbeat echoed quietly in his ears. "I have carried this ever since my mother passed away," Elijah said softly. "She told me never to open it. She said one day I would meet the man whose heart would recognize her song before his eyes recognized the handwriting." Mr. Henry smiled into his cup without speaking. Richard slowly reached toward the envelope, then stopped only inches away. "I do not understand," he admitted honestly. Elijah nodded. "Neither did I." He gently slid the envelope across the table. "Mom said the letter would only make sense after you heard me sing first. That was the order she wanted." Richard rested his fingertips on the old paper, feeling its fragile texture beneath his hand. Around him, the warm lights of the diner reflected softly against the window glass, while the last customers of the evening drifted quietly through the front door. He had spent decades believing the final chapter of Emily's life had ended in a hospital room surrounded by grief. Yet as he looked down at the unopened envelope resting before him, he realized she had quietly written another chapter without ever telling him, and somehow that forgotten chapter had found its way into the careful hands of a homeless 12-year-old boy who had carried it faithfully across an entire year. Waiting for the exact moment, hope finally caught up with memory. Richard did not open the envelope immediately. Instead, he rested both hands around it as though warming something fragile that had survived a very long winter. The cream-colored paper had yellowed with age, and the corners were softened from years of careful handling, yet the seal remained perfectly intact. Emily had always sealed her personal letters with deliberate care, pressing each flap firmly with the side of her thumb instead of using a letter opener. Even that tiny detail returned to him with startling clarity. Elijah sat quietly across the table, neither impatient nor curious. To him, the envelope had never been a mystery to solve. It had simply been a promise to protect. "Mr." Henry looked through the diner window toward the glowing streetlights, giving Richard the silence he needed. Around them, the dinner crowd had begun to thin. The waitress wiped empty tables with slow, practiced motions while an elderly couple finished slices of apple pie in the corner booth. Somewhere behind the counter, fresh coffee brewed, filling the room with a warm aroma that blended gently with cinnamon and baked bread. Richard finally slid one finger beneath the edge of the seal. The paper separated with a soft whisper that somehow sounded louder than the passing trains outside. Inside rested a single folded sheet, written entirely in Emily's familiar handwriting. His eyes lingered on the first line before he could continue. "Dear Richard, if you are reading this, then life has done something neither of us could have planned." He swallowed hard and continued reading. "I hope the person who carried this letter to you was welcomed with kindness before questions. If that happened, then you already understand the most important part of this story." Richard's vision blurred for a moment, but he kept reading. "Several years ago, I met a young woman named Angela. She walked into my Saturday music class, convinced that her voice no longer mattered because life had become too difficult. I watched her sing anyway. She reminded me that courage does not always sound loud. Sometimes it sounds gentle enough that only people willing to stop can hear it." Richard smiled through damp eyes. Those words sounded exactly like Emily. The letter continued. "Angela promised me something before we said goodbye. She said if she ever had a child, she would teach that child to use music the way kindness should always be used, freely, honestly, and without expecting anything in return. I promised her something too. I promised that if our paths ever crossed again through the people we loved, we would remember each other not through grief, but through generosity." Richard lowered the page for a brief moment, unable to speak. Elijah quietly watched him, his expression calm and patient. Richard continued reading. "If I am no longer beside you when this letter reaches your hands, do not spend your days wondering why. Spend them noticing who still carries hope, because hope has always traveled farther than either of us ever could. And if Angela's child is standing before you, remember this. He does not need someone to rescue him. He needs someone willing to walk beside him until he can choose his own future." Richard reached the final line. "Promise me one thing. Listen to his song before you offer him your name." Richard slowly folded the letter back along its original crease. For several quiet seconds, he stared at the table without moving. Then he looked across at Elijah, whose gentle eyes reflected the warm light hanging above the booth. Richard understood at last why Emily had never told him about the letter. She had trusted that compassion would arrive before explanation. She had trusted that the right moment could not be scheduled, purchased, or forced. It had to be earned. Outside, another train rolled through the station, its distant whistle blending with the quiet rhythm of the city. Richard placed the letter carefully back inside the envelope and smiled at Elijah with a warmth that felt both new and strangely familiar. In that simple moment, he realized the greatest gift Emily had left behind was not hidden inside the letter at all. It was sitting across the table from him, quietly proving that one act of kindness could continue changing lives long after the person who began it was gone. When they stepped outside, the night air felt colder than before, but Richard barely noticed. He tucked Emily's letter safely inside the inner pocket of his coat, pressing it gently against his heart as though afraid it might disappear if he let go. The streets shimmered beneath rows of amber streetlights, and a cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the quiet neighborhood. Elijah adjusted his backpack and smiled toward Mr. Henry. "I will stop by tomorrow after school hours to check on you," he said. Mr. Henry nodded warmly. "Only if you promise to keep singing." Elijah laughed softly. "That part is easy." Richard watched the exchange with quiet admiration. There was no obligation in their friendship, only genuine care. It reminded him of something Emily once told him after one of her community classes. Real wealth is measured by the number of people who feel less alone because you exist. He had admired those words back then, but somewhere along the years, he had become too busy building companies to notice whether anyone felt less alone because of him. As they reached the sidewalk outside the church, Richard finally spoke. "Elijah, would you let me drive you somewhere safe tonight?" The boy looked thoughtful rather than excited. "Thank you, sir, but I already have a place." Richard remembered the shelter records ending months earlier. "Is it a shelter?" Elijah gently shook his head. "Not anymore. A pastor lets me sleep in a small room above the community music hall when it is empty. I help clean the chairs before morning programs." Richard felt a quiet sense of relief. "Would you mind showing me?" Elijah studied him for a brief moment before smiling. "Sure." They walked together only 4 blocks before reaching a modest red brick building tucked between a neighborhood library and a small grocery store. The sign above the entrance read Harmony Community Music Center. The windows were dark except for one soft light glowing upstairs. Elijah unlocked the side door with a small silver key hanging from a shoelace around his neck. "Pastor Lewis trusts me with this," he explained proudly. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old wood, furniture polish, and sheet music. Children's drawings covered one wall beside faded photographs of holiday concerts stretching back decades. Richard slowed to examine them. One framed picture caught his attention immediately. Emily stood in the center of a choir nearly 20 years earlier, smiling beside a much younger Pastor Lewis. Beneath the photograph hung a brass plaque reading Founding Community Music Volunteers. Richard stared at it in disbelief. He had donated to dozens of charities over the years, yet he had never known Emily. Continued volunteering here after her illness began. Elijah noticed the photograph and smiled. "Pastor says Miss Emily came here even when she was tired. He said she believed music should never stop just because life became difficult." Richard quietly nodded, unable to trust his voice. At that moment, an older man with kind eyes stepped out from a nearby office carrying a stack of hymn books. "Elijah, you are back," he said before noticing Richard. His expression softened with immediate recognition. "Mr. Caldwell." Richard extended his hand. "Pastor Lewis." They shook hands warmly. Pastor Lewis glanced toward Elijah before smiling. "I have wondered for years when this meeting might finally happen." Richard looked surprised. "You knew?" Pastor Lewis nodded gently. "Angela told me about Emily's promise. She also asked me to protect one more thing until the right time." Without another word, the pastor walked back into his office and returned, carrying a worn wooden music box no larger than a shoebox. He placed it carefully into Richard's hands. "Angela left this here before she passed away," he said softly. "She said it belonged to the future, not the past. And she believed only one song would tell you when it was finally time to open it. Tonight, that song found you." Richard rested the wooden music box on a small oak table inside Pastor Lewis's office. Its dark walnut surface had been polished so many times that the grain shimmered softly beneath the warm desk lamp. Brass hinges framed the edges, worn smooth by careful hands over many years. There was no lock, no nameplate, only a tiny carved treble clef on the lid. Elijah stood quietly beside Pastor Lewis, saying nothing. Somehow, the silence felt respectful rather than uncomfortable, as though everyone in the room understood that some moments deserved patience more than words. Richard slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay several carefully arranged keepsakes. A faded recital program. A bundle of handwritten sheet music tied together with pale blue ribbon. A silver music pendant shaped like a tiny eighth note. Beneath them rested a thick envelope and a small cassette tape labeled in Emily's handwriting, "Winter Workshop Final Song." Richard stared at the tape for several seconds. He had not seen one in years. Pastor Lewis smiled gently. "Angela asked me never to convert it into a digital recording. She wanted the person who finally listened to hear every pause exactly the way it was recorded." Richard carefully picked up the envelope. Unlike the first letter, this one was addressed to both him and Angela. The handwriting remained unmistakably Emily's. He unfolded the pages slowly. "My dear friends, if this box has finally been opened, then something beautiful has happened. It means kindness has traveled farther than either of us could ever predict." Richard continued reading while Elijah listened quietly nearby. "Angela, thank you for believing your voice mattered again. Richard, thank you for believing my dream mattered, even when it seemed too small to change anything. You both taught me that hope is never measured by numbers. It grows one person at a time." Richard paused as emotion settled into every word. The letter continued. "Years from now, there may be children we never meet. Some will have homes filled with music. Others will carry songs through seasons of loneliness. Please promise me that no child will ever be told their circumstances determine the value of their voice. Music belongs equally to the wealthy and the forgotten, because the human heart cannot hear income." Richard lowered the page, unable to speak for several moments. Pastor Lewis quietly reached toward an old cassette player resting on a nearby bookshelf. "She asked me to keep this working too," he said with a warm smile. He gently inserted the tape and pressed play. A soft mechanical click echoed through the room before a faint layer of tape hiss filled the silence. Then Emily's voice emerged. It sounded younger, bright, with gentle laughter. "All right, everyone," she said cheerfully. "Take a deep breath. Remember, perfection is not our goal. We are here to help somebody feel less alone." A group of children laughed in the background. Richard closed his eyes immediately. It was the first time he had heard Emily's speaking voice in nearly 2 decades. Tears quietly gathered, but he made no effort to hide them. A piano began playing softly, followed by dozens of children's voices joining together in harmony. Among them, one young adult voice rose with unmistakable warmth. Pastor Lewis smiled toward Elijah. "That is your mother." Elijah listened without blinking, his eyes fixed on the old cassette player, as though hearing Angela sing beside Emily for the very first time. Richard suddenly understood why the melody Elijah carried had felt so familiar. It had never belonged to only one person. It had been passed from Emily to Angela, from Angela to Elijah, each generation protecting it not as a performance but as an act of love. When the recording ended, the room settled into complete silence, except for the gentle turning of the cassette reels. Richard looked at Elijah with quiet certainty. "Your mother kept her promise," he said softly. Elijah smiled through moist eyes. "And Miss Emily kept hers too." The next morning, sunlight poured through the tall, stained-glass windows of Harmony Community Music Center, scattering ribbons of gold, blue, and crimson across the polished wooden floor. Dust floated lazily through the beams of light, while the faint scent of old sheet music and fresh coffee filled the quiet building. Elijah arrived before 8 o'clock carrying a broom over one shoulder, just as he had done countless mornings before. He swept each row of folding chairs with careful attention, straightened music stands, and wiped fingerprints from the piano lid until it reflected the colorful windows above. Nothing about his routine suggested he expected his life to change. He simply did the work because someone had trusted him to do it well. A familiar black sedan rolled slowly to the curb outside, but this time Richard stepped out alone, carrying neither briefcase nor phone. Instead, he held only the wooden music box beneath one arm and Emily's letters tucked safely inside his coat. Elijah looked up with an easy smile. "Good morning, Mr. Richard." Richard smiled back. "Good morning, Elijah." For a few moments they worked together in comfortable silence. Richard unfolded chairs while Elijah aligned them into neat rows. Neither mentioned the letters, the cassette, or the promises from the night before. Somehow the quiet itself felt meaningful. Pastor Lewis eventually entered carrying 2 cups of hot cocoa instead of coffee. He handed one to Elijah first. "You earned this." Elijah laughed softly before wrapping both hands around the warm paper cup. Richard noticed the gesture and remembered how often Emily had insisted children should always be served before adults. Some lessons, he realized, survived without anyone deliberately teaching them again. After the chairs were arranged, Richard looked around the modest room. The paint showed its age. Several ceiling tiles carried faint water stains. Half the music stands leaned slightly to one side, repaired more than once. Yet despite its imperfections, the room felt alive. Children's drawings covered one bulletin board beside handwritten thank you notes from families who had once attended free lessons here. Richard slowly turned toward Pastor Lewis. "How many children come every week?" The pastor smiled. "Usually 40 or 50. We make room for whoever walks through the door." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "And if you had more instruments?" Pastor Lewis looked surprised. "We could probably serve twice that number." Richard remained quiet for another moment before speaking again. "Then let us make room." Pastor Lewis blinked. "What do you mean?" Richard looked around the room once more, seeing it now through Emily's eyes rather than his own. New instruments, building repairs, scholarships, utilities, whatever keeps these doors open without families worrying about cost. Elijah looked up immediately. "Really?" Richard smiled gently. "Not because I am rescuing anyone." He looked directly at the boy. "Because Emily believed this place mattered, Angela protected that belief. And you reminded me that promises should continue growing instead of ending." Pastor Lewis slowly removed his glasses. his eyes glistening beneath the morning light. She always hoped this room would outlive all of us. Richard nodded. Then let us make sure it does. Elijah remained silent for several seconds before asking the one question Richard had not expected. Can other kids who sleep in shelters come too? Richard smiled without hesitation. Every child who wants to learn belongs here. Elijah's face brightened with quiet joy. It was not the excitement of receiving something for himself. It was the happiness of imagining doors opening for children he had not even met yet. Watching that simple expression, Richard understood the final lesson Emily had left behind. True generosity was never measured by what one person received. It was measured by how many others would one day stand a little taller because someone chose to believe they belonged. 3 months later, the first snow of December drifted gently across downtown Chicago, settling softly on rooftops, park benches, and the stone steps leading into Harmony Community Music Center. Warm golden light spilled from every window, carrying laughter and piano music into the crisp evening air. The old building looked different now. Fresh paint brightened the walls. New instruments rested neatly inside polished classrooms. Children's artwork covered every hallway, each drawing signed proudly in colorful crayons. Yet despite every improvement, the heart of the place remained exactly the same. Every child who entered was greeted by name before anyone asked where they came from. Richard stood quietly near the back of the auditorium, dressed in a simple navy coat instead of one of his tailored business suits. No reserved seat waited for him. No photographers lined the entrance. That had been his choice. Tonight was not about a billionaire. It was about promises that had quietly survived long enough to bloom. Families filled every row of seats. Some wore expensive winter coats. Others arrived carrying donated scarves and worn gloves. Sitting together, no one could tell the difference anymore. Pastor Lewis stepped onto the small wooden stage and smiled at the audience. Before we begin tonight's winter concert, he said warmly, there is one young musician who reminds us why this building exists. Soft applause filled the room as Elijah walked onto the stage carrying the same weathered guitar case he had once opened beneath the old train station awning. The guitar itself had been carefully restored, but Richard noticed one detail had never changed. Elijah still wore the small silver shoelace around his neck, holding the old key to the music center. Some things, Richard realized, should never be replaced. Elijah adjusted the microphone slightly before looking out across the audience. His eyes briefly found Richard near the back of the room. Richard simply nodded once. No words were needed. Elijah smiled and spoke quietly. My mother used to tell me that songs are like kindness. You never really know how far they travel. The room became perfectly still. Then the first gentle notes filled the air. It was the same hymn Richard had heard beneath the rain months earlier. Yet somehow it sounded even warmer now. Dozens of children joined Elijah one by one, until the entire stage became a choir of voices rising together beneath strings of white lights. Some children sang confidently, others missed a few notes. One little girl smiled through every lyric without worrying whether she sounded perfect. Richard found himself smiling too. Emily would have loved that. As the final chorus faded into silence, the audience rose to its feet in one long standing ovation. Elijah looked almost embarrassed by the applause. Instead of taking another bow, he stepped away from the microphone and quietly helped a nervous younger boy move his wheelchair into position for the next performance. Without saying anything, Elijah adjusted the child's music stand, whispered a few encouraging words, and stepped aside so someone else could shine. Richard felt tears gather once more. But this time, they carried no weight of grief, only gratitude. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat where Emily's letter still rested, now softened from being carried every day. He did not need to read it anymore. He already knew every word by heart. Outside, snow continued falling across the quiet streets, while warm music drifted through the winter night, reaching strangers who slowed their steps for just a moment to listen. Some never knew who was singing. Some never learned the names of Emily, Angela, Richard, or Elijah. It did not matter. The song had done exactly what it was always meant to do. It reminded ordinary people that hope often arrives in the gentlest voice. Kindness becomes strongest when it is shared. And sometimes the greatest miracle is not changing the whole world, but changing one heart deeply enough that it begins changing the lives of others.